one of the pleasing things about that book was that they erected many of the early lifts in Melbourne. One of the great buildings in Melbourne, and it was here I think until the early 1950s, was on the northwest corner of Flinders Lane and Elizabeth Street. It was called the Australian Building, and in its last years had fallen on evil days. It was about 13 stories high and was really one of the great buildings of Australia. I found out that when the building commenced, it was taller than any building in New York and Chicago. When they commenced the building, it was taller than any building in New York and Chicago. And with great pride, I mentioned that in my history of Johns and Wagwood, which you can pay a large price for in any antiquarian bookshop. Unfortunately, the word got round, and it's interesting how things become legends, and I see that statement repeated again and again, that when erected it was the tallest building in the world. But of course it wasn't. Chicago and New York were building skyscrapers with such speed. I must just say one other reminiscence. I got great pleasure in being asked to do jobs for which I wasn't really equipped, but they were great challenges. There was a wonderful organisation in Australia called ANZAS, the Australian New Zealand Association for the Advancement of Science, and I think every 2 years it held conferences, and all the intellectual disciplines of Australia came together, whether geology or history or economics, and often they shared their knowledge. Geoff Leaper, who was the Professor of Agriculture at Melbourne University, had to prepare a handbook to Victoria for this conference, and he said, "Will I write a history of Victoria in 5,000 words?" And I think in 2 months, and I did it with great pleasure. It gives you some idea of how little research was being carried on then, either in government departments or in universities. I found out a very simple fact which nobody had found out before. It gave me great pleasure. You know, from 1861, from the end of the first gold rushes, from 1861 to 1947, in every census, Victoria grew more slowly than New South Wales. From 1861 to 1947, in every census, Victoria grew at a slower percentage pace than New South Wales. By just looking up the yearbooks, I found out that from 1947 to 54, and doing my little calculation, Victoria was now growing faster than New South Wales. And I put that in the little book. The sensation it caused, even in Parliament House. I must say something about the way the writing of history has altered. When I first wrote history in 1954, there were very few aids to research. There was no Dictionary of Australian Biography, or Australian Dictionary of Biography, which is a remarkable aid to anybody doing research on Australian history. That didn't begin till the 1960s. There was no Dictionary of Australian Quotations, Stephen Murray Smith's work, except a relatively small work, I think produced in the 1890s by E. Morris, who was Professor of English Literature at Melbourne University. There were virtually no printed bibliographies showing what had already been published. There was no Oxford Companion to Australian History. You could list 20 or 30 important reference works which historians now rejoice in, and they didn't exist in those days. There was, of course, also no photocopying, and I suppose there was a photocopying machine of sorts, but it must have been too expensive, and certainly the libraries didn't have them. And one of the great difficulties of research was if you were doing a book which relied on research in several cities, you knew that you couldn't afford to visit several cities, and on your one visit, say to the Mitchell Library in Sydney, you'd take voluminous notes, not knowing whether you would use the material in the notes or whether they would be useless, but you took voluminous notes because you knew you would never go back there again. Photocopying has made an enormous difference. Of course, photocopying is a menace. I think all new technology is a menace unless you use it properly, and one finds oneself taking far more photocopies than one will ever use. Of course, the cheap photocopying machine eventually reached the university libraries, and many students who had no intention of working took photocopies on a large scale and showed them to you to show how hard they'd been working. It's curious how few books were written in those days. I think it's astonishing the number of books that come out each year on Australian history. Books that have something interesting to tell you, whether it's on local history or whether on grand themes. In 1954, so little was published. There was a very useful publication produced by Graham Johnston, who'd been Professor of English at Melbourne University and then I think went to the Defence Forces Academy in Canberra. It was produced by Oxford University Press and it was called Annals of Australian Literature. I think the edition I used came out in 1970 and he died not long afterwards, and I don't think it's been continued, has it? Is there still an Annals of Australian Literature? I think not. It would become too big. But I looked up yesterday a copy I have at home of the Annals of Australian Literature, and it lists nearly all the books that are published in a year, unless they're books published by the Camperdown Press or the Broken Hill Miner or some such. And the list for 1954, on the side it says Overland established, Stephen Murray Smith's magazine. I think it says Chester Wilmot dies, and somebody else had died, and then it lists the books that are published in that year. He didn't publish everything, but there are 36 books. Only 12 of them are books of history. Of course, they include books by famous authors. Mary Gilmore, a volume of verse, Judah Watton, a novel, The Unbending, a small list of history books, including Marnie Bassett's The Henties, Frank Crowley's Bibliography of Western Australia, and Geoffrey Blainey's The Peaks of Lyell. Curiously, The Peaks of Lyell is still in print, largely because I've lived long enough to keep on producing new editions. It's the only book of 1954, I think, that's still in print. But one of the sad things about today and the multiplicity of books, so many of them good books, is that you can write a good book in Australia and it will never be reviewed in a major newspaper. You can now write a good book, a valuable book in Australia, that people, when they come to read it, praise it highly, but it will not be reviewed in a daily newspaper and may not even be reviewed in one of the main literary magazines. So much is published. You really were on clover in the 1950s because the literary editors, and they didn't have much space, would be delighted if a new book came in on a particular week, because the next week there might be no new book, and the next week there might be no new book. And this book I wrote, which was really a local history on the west coast of Tasmania, it got a very large, the main review in the Age Literary Supplement, because I suppose nothing else came out that week or the previous week, and reviewed in papers throughout Australia. It's a great problem for writers today, communicating to a public and letting them know that there is a book available. I'm ashamed to say that when I first wrote history, and my first book was The Peaks of Lyell, and then I wrote John's of Waygood, and then I wrote a centenary history of Melbourne University, and then I think I wrote a history of the National Bank for their centenary in 1958 called Golden Paper, and then I wrote a book, history of mining in northwest Queensland, called Mines in the Spinifex. And when I look at those books, all kinds of things I should have written about are not mentioned there. My first book was on Mount Lyell, and I looked at it the other day to see what I said about the Aborigines. I never heard anybody talk about Aborigines on the west coast of Tasmania. As far as we knew, there were none living there, and nobody knew of any Aboriginal sites, and many of them have since been discovered. I looked through the book. Aborigines are not in the index, but I found, I think, the only place where Aborigines are mentioned in that book, and this was typical of writers of that generation. It says on, I think, the fourth paragraph after I've described Abel Tasman discovering the peaks on the west coast of Tasmania, it says something like this: meanwhile, for many years, only the wandering blacks heard the roar of the surf, and that's the only mention they receive. And women, there's hardly a mention of women in that book. It's astonishing how women's history has taken hold and all the new insights that have come to light. I looked through some of my books, and the first time I paid attention to women's history was when I just married my wife Anne, and we went to Mount Isa, and I was working in the late 1950s on the book that became Mines in the Spinifex. And we had a Dodge ute, and we used to drive around the countryside to the old towns, and often the women were the great witnesses of things that happened, and for the first time women were seriously mentioned in that in a book of mine. One of the great changes, and many of you who are old will have noticed this, there's been, with the coming of television and radio, an incredible improvement in grammar. You know, the average Australian living in the bush 50 or 60 years ago used the grammar of their fathers and their grandfathers, the grammar of their grandmothers and their great-grandmothers. The great phrase then, and my wife said, "I've got a title for your book." I said, "What's that?" The great phrase was "in them days." And you don't hear it now, do you? We say television is bad, but television and radio have had a profound effect, and a good effect in many ways, on language. And the green issues have come into vogue, especially since the late 1960s. By chance, I was at a place which is important in green history, the west coast of Tasmania, and I wrote a lot about the landscape and how it had taken its denuded form, but green writing then was very uncommon. So new fields of history have come into vogue, and it's great to see them in vogue. There's one thing that's happened which I think is disappointing. There's a great decline in economic history. When I went to secondary school, and even those who went 10 years or 15 years after me, a large part of the Australian history syllabus had a considerable component of economic history in it. It had the Land Acts, which were fairly boring, but they were quite important. There was always a lot to be studied on the gold rushes. The convicts were treated in part as economic creatures who added something to the workforce. And I think nearly all people who studied history then knew quite a bit indirectly about economic history. There's been a great decline in the teaching of economic history and in the knowledge of economic history. And it's sad to think that an important facet of the history of our nation, knowledge, in one sense, has gone backward. Could I just give a few simple examples? I was very interested in all the discussion on global warming, and it's one of the most interesting intellectual topics that has come around us in the last 100 or 200 years. There was a summit on the drought in the Murray-Darling Basin held at Canberra, I think, in November 2006. And one of the high officials of the Murray-Darling Basin said, "This is a drought in 1,000 years." And of course, a statement as dramatic as that goes round and round in Australia and will never be caught again. I thought it was a bit outrageous because the Murray-Darling Basin had a drought in the 1890s and early 1900s that was comparable to the drought being experienced there, the terrible drought being experienced there. It may be that the present drought will prove to be worse than the one in the 1890s and early 1900s. But there are very few people, historians, interested in important issues like that. I remember reading something very simple again and again in the newspapers that global warming was drying up the whole continent. Well, since Australia is a huge continent and since we have many different climates, it's very unlikely that global warming will dry up the whole continent. And I thought I'll do a little bit of research on this since I couldn't find anything that had been conveniently done. And I found the records of the Bureau of Meteorology. We've only had nationwide rainfall records in Australia since the year 1900. We've had records in many individual places that go back much further, but it's only since the year 1900 that we've had enough weather stations placed right across Australia, north to south and east to west, to have a nationwide measure of rainfall. To my surprise, do you know which were the great years of dryness in Australia since we've had nationwide records? Not 2000, not 1990. The two worst years were 1902 and 1905. They're the two worst years of rainfall in Australia as a whole since we've had nationwide records. I suspect I could be wrong, that if we had records, nationwide records for the 1890s, we might get a third year in that group. And of course, droughts were infinitely more devastating. Their economic consequences were far more profound and wide-sweeping in 1900 than they are today. We had such a huge rural sector, the city so dependent on rural economic activity for their daily wealth. But I thought to myself, I wrote, when I said this to somebody in the Australian, they said that's news to us, and I wrote an article for their Saturday supplement. But I thought afterwards, this is not my field, this must be the field of some historian, but the historians in that field are so few that their knowledge is not reaching the general public on a matter of great importance. It's interesting that even in, and I must finish now, so there's time for questions. It's interesting that even in this global financial slump or recession, that many elementary things, which I think would once have been fairly common knowledge amongst those who are studying economic history, don't seem to creep into the general debate. I mean, one statement one can make with some ease. If you have a long boom, and we've had a very long boom in Australia since the early 1990s, one of the most remarkable booms accompanied by an increase in the standard of living for the average Australian. We've had this long boom, and all booms come to an end. All booms come to an end usually painfully, because all kinds of things are concealed or camouflaged in the good times. I looked in vain in the financial papers for quite a long time for a simple statement like that, which acts as a warning system in the bad times we're in. I was especially interested when the federal government faced this awkward dilemma of would there be a run on the banks in Australia. And since Iceland and several other countries had taken action, in the end the Australian government decided to guarantee bank deposits. It's a very difficult historical situation. Nobody had to do it in the early 1930s, even though we had a depression incomparably worse than that which we will experience this year and next year. But I thought it's interesting that nobody has looked for precedents, and I tapped my head and I immediately thought of one precedent which I looked up this morning. We had terrible banking failures in Australia in 1893. One after another, the banks had to close their doors because they'd run out of coin. In those days, if the customers asked for gold coin, you had to give to them. We were on the gold standard, and you had no alternative but to keep enough gold so that if customers came in with a cheque and said, I don't want a banknote, I want gold, you have to pay to them. And this was a different kind of a crisis to that which faced the federal government a few weeks ago, but similar in this effect, that once you start giving favourable treatment to one institution or another kind of institution, there are ricochet effects. And in this banking crisis centred in Melbourne in 1893, and about half the deposits of the Australian banking system were frozen for a considerable time. In this terrible banking crisis which did such harm to Victoria, the Commercial Bank of Australia, possibly the biggest bank in Victoria, closed its doors. And the Commercial Bank of Australia decided that since it wasn't going to give its customers back their money for a time, it would open the branches as a safe deposit. And people could bring their money into the Commercial Bank of Australia and they would put it in a safe. They'd give you a receipt and you could take it back whenever you liked. Immediately, money started coming out of sound banks, and being taken to the Commercial Bank of Australia, and thus endangering the sound banks, which were short of gold. And I thought these are the kinds of little bits of history which, if we had a stronger movement in economic history, would be part of general circulation or would be known by the specialists and thus could be called upon by governments in a time of difficulty and bewilderment. I must conclude, these are my few random reflections. The important thing about history, to my mind, is that it is the great court of appeal in so many debates. There are so many debates of public interest which are largely or partly appeals to history. The debate on the Republic is, of course, in considerable part an appeal to history. Global warming, is the present situation worse than in the past, or is it still equal? Is it partly due to global warming or not? That's a profoundly historical question. Again and again, in looking at the matters that interest us, there's a historical component in the debate. And for that reason, I think it's so important that we should study history and that students in schools should be taught history as long as the history is made interesting to them. I conclude by paying tribute to Stephen Murray Smith, who was one of Anne and I, my very good friends, with Nita too. And I also pay tribute to the State Library of Victoria, because I suppose my path to being a historian began in the newspaper room with my old friends wearing their overcoats.